Along Peru's arid Pacific coast, a chain of short rivers descends abruptly from the Andes and disappears into the desert before reaching the sea. Within these narrow valleys, sustained by seasonal meltwater and Andean rainfall, one of the earliest complex societies in the Americas emerged. The region later associated with the Caral-Supe Civilization developed not in a fertile rainforest or broad floodplain, but within an environment defined by climatic instability, extreme aridity, and ecological contrast. The north-central coast of present-day Peru receives minimal annual rainfall, often less than 10 millimeters. The surrounding landscape is dominated by desert plains broken only by river valleys such as the Supe, Patavilca, Fortaleza, and Waura. These rivers originate in the Andean highlands, where seasonal precipitation and glacial melt generate runoff that sustains downstream agriculture. Geological surveys confirm that these water systems created linear oases cutting through otherwise inhospitable terrain. Early settlement patterns concentrated along these corridors, where arable land was limited but renewable. Between approximately 5,000 and 3,500 BCE, archaeological evidence indicates the presence of pre-ceramic communities occupying both inland valleys and adjacent coastal zones. Excavations in the Supe Valley reveal small habitation sites characterized by reed structures, hearths, and organic refuse deposits. The absence of pottery in these early layers classifies the period within the Andean pre-ceramic tradition. Radiocarbon samples obtained from charcoal and plant remains demonstrate long-term occupation prior to monumental construction phases. The ecological system of the region was defined by a dual resource base. Offshore, the Humboldt Current generated one of the richest marine ecosystems in the world. Cold, nutrient-dense waters supported large populations of anchovy and sardine, species later found in abundance at inland sites. Zooarchaeological analysis conducted at Caral confirms that marine protein formed a significant component of early diets. Fish bones, shell remains, and net weights appear in stratified deposits dated to the 3rd millennium BCE. Simultaneously, inland riverbanks supported cultivation. Archaeobotanical remains indicate the domestication or managed growth of squash, beans, sweet potato, guava, and most significantly cotton, Gossypium barbadense. Cotton played a functional economic role rather than a decorative one. Fiber analysis shows its use in woven fishing nets, which increased maritime yield efficiency. This interdependence between inland cultivators and coastal fishers created a stable exchange system linking ecological zones. The coordination required to maintain this exchange suggests early forms of organized labor and resource management. Hydrological conditions shaped settlement density. Because river flow varied seasonally, irrigation management became essential. While large canal systems are more clearly visible in later phases, sediment mapping indicates early diversion channels that allowed controlled distribution of water to adjacent fields. Agricultural productivity remained geographically confined, encouraging clustered habitation rather than dispersed settlement. Population estimates for the Supe Valley during this early stage remain tentative, but site density surveys indicate gradual demographic growth by 3500 BCE. Archaeologists, including Ruth Shady, conducted systematic excavations beginning in the 1990s that clarified the chronology of these settlements. Radiocarbon dating from deep occupational layers at Caral produced calibrated dates extending to approximately 3000 BCE, establishing the antiquity of complex activity in the valley. These findings revised earlier assumptions that large-scale social organization in the Americas developed significantly later. Stratigraphic analysis confirmed continuous occupation rather than abrupt migration into the region. Environmental constraints shaped social development in measurable ways. Limited arable land required coordinated water use. Marine reliance encouraged interregional exchange. The absence of timber and stone in easily accessible forms influenced architectural experimentation with locally available materials such as river cobbles and woven reed bags. Geological studies also confirm that the region is seismically active, a factor that later influenced construction techniques designed for stability. The Andean highlands to the east provided additional ecological interaction. While direct evidence of early highland trade remains limited for this period, obsidian sourcing studies suggest eventual exchange networks extending into interior zones. The Supe Valley thus functioned not as an isolated enclave but as part of a vertically integrated Andean ecological system. By the mid-4th millennium BCE, stable habitation in these river valleys had created the environmental and economic conditions necessary for increased social coordination. Settlement permanence replaced seasonal mobility. Agricultural cultivation intensified alongside maritime specialization. These interlocking systems established the material foundation upon which later monumental architecture and political organization would emerge. As stable riverine communities expanded, subsistence strategies shifted from seasonal mobility toward structured agricultural and labor systems. Before continuing deeper into the development of early Andean society, viewers are encouraged to support the channel by subscribing and enabling notifications. Regular uploads provide structured, research-driven historical documentaries covering early civilizations and empires. Subscribing ensures consistent access to new long-form analyses as they are released. Engagement through comments is also valuable. Viewers are invited to share which segment of the documentary they find most informative or analytically compelling. Audience feedback helps guide future topics and allows for continued refinement of research focus and presentation. BY 3000 BCE. Settlements in the Supe Valley were no longer seasonal encampments but coordinated communities capable of sustained construction. Archaeological layers across the north-central Peruvian coast indicate a gradual but decisive shift from mobile subsistence strategies toward permanent habitation. This transformation occurred between approximately 3500 and 3000 BCE and marked a structural change in how populations organized labor, managed resources, and occupied space. Earlier interpretations of early Andean development emphasized maritime subsistence as the primary catalyst for social complexity. This perspective, often associated with the maritime foundations of Andean civilization model proposed by Michael Mosley, argued that abundant marine protein from the Pacific sustained large populations independent of agriculture. However, excavations at inland centers such as Caral have revised this interpretation. Archaeobotanical remains, irrigation features, and storage facilities demonstrate that agriculture played a central and coordinated role in sustaining population growth. Records indicate that early canal systems diverted seasonal runoff from the Supe River into adjacent fields. Sediment analysis confirms anthropogenic modification of natural water channels. These irrigation networks, though modest in scale compared to later Andean systems, required collective maintenance and scheduling. Their existence suggests a level of social coordination extending beyond kin-based cooperation. Agricultural remains include squash, beans, sweet potato, and particularly cotton, Gossypium barbadense, a crop of strategic importance. Cotton was not primarily cultivated for clothing. Textile fragments and fiber analysis indicate its primary function was the production of fishing nets. Zooarchaeological studies reveal substantial quantities of anchovy, Angraulus ringens, and sardine remains at inland settlements. Because these species are coastal, their presence inland confirms systematic exchange between maritime and riverine communities. Inland agriculturalists produced cotton. Coastal fishers supplied marine protein. This reciprocal system strengthened economic interdependence across ecological zones. Archaeologists uncovered storage structures within residential sectors, suggesting accumulation and redistribution of goods. The presence of standardized storage pits implies planning and surplus management rather than immediate consumption. Such storage capacity reduced vulnerability to seasonal fluctuations in both river discharge and fish availability. Stable food supply permitted population concentration and reduced the need for cyclical migration. Settlement morphology also changed during this period. Excavations reveal more permanent architectural foundations composed of stone alignments and prepared floors. The shift from temporary reed shelters to more durable structures indicates long-term occupation. Spatial organization becomes more structured, with residential clusters arranged around communal spaces. This pattern reflects increasing social cohesion and possibly emergent leadership roles coordinating construction and maintenance. The absence of defensive walls or weapon concentrations is notable. Archaeological surveys across the Supe and adjacent valleys show no significant fortifications dating to this early phase. Skeletal remains do not display widespread trauma associated with organized warfare. This suggests that regional integration occurred in a relatively stable context, without evidence of sustained intergroup conflict. Such stability may have allowed economic specialization to develop without diversion of labor toward defense. Radiocarbon dating provides chronological clarity. Samples from deep stratigraphic contexts at Caral yield calibrated dates around 2627 BCE for early monumental phases. These dates place organized community development in the Supe Valley contemporaneous with early urban formations in Mesopotamia and Egypt, though arising independently and under different technological conditions. The Andean region lacked ceramics and metallurgy at this stage, yet exhibited increasing social coordination. The transition from maritime foraging to integrated agro-maritime subsistence demonstrates how environmental adaptation can generate structural complexity. Riverine agriculture supported fiber production. Maritime exchange provided protein stability. Irrigation required cooperation. Storage enabled demographic expansion. Each development reinforced the others in a cumulative process. By the close of the 4th millennium BCE, the Supe Valley contained permanent communities with organized labor systems, interregional exchange networks, and surplus management strategies. These foundations did not yet constitute a fully stratified political state, but they created the material conditions necessary for centralized ceremonial construction. Cooperative labor networks were established, food security had improved, and settlement permanence had reshaped the landscape. With food security and cooperative labor networks established, large-scale ceremonial construction soon became a defining feature of the region. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, Caral was no longer simply a settlement. It was a regional center of authority. Between approximately 2600 and 2400 BCE, the site expanded in both scale and organizational complexity, transforming into the principal administrative and ceremonial hub of the Caral-Supe Civilization. Archaeological mapping demonstrates that this transformation was neither accidental nor gradual in an unstructured sense. The layout reflects deliberate planning, coordinated labor, and centralized oversight. The urban core of Caral covers roughly 66 hectares and is organized into distinct architectural sectors. 6 large platform mounds dominate the central zone, including the Pyramid Mayor, which rises approximately 28 meters. Surrounding these monumental structures are residential complexes, open plazas, and sunken circular courts. The spatial arrangement is not random. Excavation plans reveal axial alignments and repeated architectural proportions, suggesting adherence to standardized design principles. Urban zoning indicates differentiation within the population. Residences located adjacent to major pyramids are larger, constructed with higher quality materials, and contain evidence of restricted access. Peripheral domestic clusters are smaller and more uniform. Archaeologists uncovered variation in room size, floor preparation, and associated artifact density. This spatial hierarchy implies administrative or ritual elites residing near ceremonial centers, while laboring populations occupied surrounding areas. Such differentiation marks a transition from kin-based settlement toward stratified urban organization. Construction methods further reinforce the presence of centralized oversight. Platform mounds were built using shikra technology, woven reed bags filled with stones and stacked within retaining walls. This technique appears consistently across major structures. Standardization in fill composition, wall thickness, and orientation suggests coordinated engineering practices rather than independent household initiatives. Radiocarbon samples from construction layers cluster within tight chronological ranges, indicating organized building campaigns rather than sporadic additions. No defensive walls encircle the site. Surveys have not identified weapon caches or fortification systems dating to this period. Skeletal remains from burial contexts do not show widespread trauma associated with organized warfare. The absence of militarized architecture suggests that authority was maintained through administrative coordination and ritual legitimacy rather than coercive force. Governance likely depended on control of surplus, scheduling of labor, and supervision of ceremonial activities. Storage facilities distributed across the site provide material evidence of redistributive administration. Excavations reveal enclosed rooms interpreted as storage chambers containing botanical remains and textile fragments. Standardized storage capacity indicates planned accumulation of goods. Surplus from agricultural production and maritime exchange could be collected, allocated, and redistributed during communal events or construction phases. Such economic coordination would have required record-keeping, whether through memory, physical tokens, or early chord-based systems. Architectural symmetry reflects deliberate planning. The central plaza aligns with adjacent pyramids in a manner suggesting controlled sightlines and ceremonial procession routes. The repetition of sunken circular plazas across the region indicates a shared architectural template. Similar layouts have been documented in neighboring valleys, including sites in the Patavilca and Fortaleza systems. Radiocarbon sequences confirm contemporaneous occupation of these centers between 2600 and 2300 BCE. Archaeologist Ruth Shady has characterized Caral as a potential mother city within a networked regional polity. This interpretation is supported by architectural consistency across approximately 20 identified sites in the Norte Chico region. Monument scale varies, but construction techniques and spatial organization remain comparable. Such replication implies communication and coordination among settlements rather than isolated development. Settlement hierarchy appears tiered. Caral functioned as a primary node with the largest monuments and most complex zoning. Secondary centers display reduced monument size but similar planning principles. Peripheral agrarian communities contain minimal monumental architecture but show integration into the broader economic system. This distribution resembles a networked administrative structure rather than a single centralized empire. Hydrological management likely played a role in political authority. Control over irrigation scheduling would have influenced agricultural productivity. Canal maintenance required collective labor and oversight. By regulating water access and coordinating planting cycles, administrative leaders could reinforce their legitimacy. Archaeological surveys of canal alignments demonstrate maintenance episodes consistent with centralized coordination. The scale of labor mobilization provides quantitative insight into governance capacity. Engineering estimates suggest that construction of the Pyramid Mayor required tens of thousands of cubic meters of fill material. Even with organized labor rotations, such projects would have required sustained oversight over extended periods. The logistical coordination of workforce, materials, and scheduling indicates administrative sophistication. The absence of inscribed texts complicates reconstruction of political structure. However, architecture itself functions as material documentation. Repetition of design, evidence of standardized measurements, and controlled access points collectively demonstrate planned authority. The system appears to have operated through ritual centrality, economic redistribution, and infrastructural coordination rather than through standing armies or territorial fortifications. By 2400 BCE, Caral's urban form had stabilized. Monument enlargement continued, but the core layout remained consistent. Administrative authority appears to have been institutional rather than transient. Settlement synchronization across multiple valleys suggests a regional network bound by shared governance principles. Political integration did not manifest through conquest but through standardized planning and cooperative economic systems. Power in Caral appears to have been exercised through ceremony rather than conquest. Archaeological evidence from the urban center of Caral indicates that ritual performance, controlled access to sacred space, and symbolic authority formed the core mechanisms of governance between approximately 2600 and 2300 BCE. Unlike later Andean polities, no murals, reliefs, or weapon assemblages depict organized warfare. Instead, the material record emphasizes ceremonial architecture, musical instruments, controlled fire altars, and patterned offerings. Excavations within major pyramidal complexes have uncovered carefully constructed fire altars positioned on upper terraces. These altars are circular or rectangular stone-lined features containing ash deposits, burnt plant remains, and fragments of textiles. Stratigraphic analysis shows repeated episodes of burning, indicating cyclical ritual use rather than single-event activity. Carbonized botanical remains include seeds and plant fibers consistent with cultivated species. The repeated maintenance of these altars suggests organized ceremonial calendars tied to agricultural cycles or communal gatherings. Among the most significant discoveries are musical instruments found in controlled ritual contexts. Archaeologists uncovered sets of flutes crafted from pelican and Andean condor bones. These instruments were not randomly distributed. They were located within ceremonial rooms or near plaza spaces associated with public ritual. Acoustic studies of replica instruments demonstrate tonal variation sufficient for coordinated ensemble performance. The presence of multiple flutes within a single deposit indicates structured musical participation rather than isolated personal use. Music likely functioned as a mechanism of social cohesion during communal ceremonies. Large sunken circular plazas, a defining architectural feature of the Caral-Supe region, would have accommodated assembled participants. The spatial configuration of these plazas, stepped access points leading downward into a central gathering area, suggests choreographed movement and controlled visibility. Participants could be visually and audibly unified within an enclosed ceremonial environment. Architectural design thus structured social interaction and reinforced shared ideological frameworks. Residential differentiation reinforces evidence of social hierarchy. Houses adjacent to principal pyramids are larger and contain higher densities of artifacts, including fine textiles and ornamental items. Peripheral dwellings are smaller and more standardized. Burial contexts reveal variation in grave goods and interment treatment. While elaborate royal tombs characteristic of later civilizations are absent, some individuals were interred with offerings including shell beads and textile fragments. Differential burial treatment indicates emerging status distinctions within the population. The absence of militarized iconography remains notable. Excavations across the Supe, Patavilca, and Fortaleza valleys have not produced weapon concentrations comparable to those found in later Andean cultures. Skeletal analysis does not indicate widespread trauma from organized violence. Defensive walls and bastions are absent from settlement layouts. These findings support the interpretation that authority was legitimized through ritual mediation rather than coercive force. Ceremonial authority likely operated through control of sacred knowledge. Restricted access rooms located atop pyramidal platforms appear to have limited entry to select individuals. Narrow stairways and enclosed chambers suggest that ritual leaders managed visibility and participation. Public plazas enabled communal gatherings, while elevated spaces may have functioned as stages for ritual specialists. This spatial hierarchy parallels residential zoning, reinforcing a structured social order grounded in ceremonial leadership. Offerings recovered from ritual contexts include marine shells, woven textiles, and plant materials. Some shells originate from distant coastal waters, including spondylus species associated in later Andean cultures with symbolic and ritual value. Their presence indicates long-distance exchange integrated into ceremonial practice. The deposition of valuable items within fire altars suggests acts of controlled sacrifice reinforcing communal belief systems. Ritual architecture also reflects standardization across multiple valleys. Sunken circular plazas at sites beyond Caral share consistent proportions and construction techniques. This repetition implies shared ceremonial norms across the broader Norte Chico region. Uniform ritual design supports the existence of coordinated ideological systems linking settlements. Authority therefore extended beyond individual sites into a regional ceremonial network. The integration of ritual and administration can be inferred from construction logistics. Monumental architecture required coordinated labor mobilization, scheduling, and resource allocation. Ritual gatherings likely served as moments to organize workforce participation and redistribute stored goods. Ceremonial events thus reinforced both ideological unity and economic coordination. Governance functioned as an interwoven system combining belief, surplus management, and architectural planning. Archaeological findings provide additional evidence of textile production within ritual contexts. Fine cotton weaving demonstrates technical proficiency and organized labor specialization. Textile fragments recovered from ceremonial deposits indicate that ritual display may have involved regulated attire or symbolic ornamentation. Cotton cultivation, already central to fishing net production, thus intersected with ceremonial presentation. The structured use of fire altars, music, and communal plazas reveals a society in which ritual practice structured public life. Authority was not abstract. It was enacted through recurring ceremonial events visible to assembled populations. Leaders likely derived legitimacy from perceived mediation between ecological cycles and communal well-being. Agricultural scheduling, water management, and ritual calendars were mutually reinforcing systems. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, Caral exhibits clear markers of stratified yet non-militarized governance. Spatial hierarchy, differential burial treatment, controlled ceremonial spaces, and standardized ritual architecture collectively indicate an organized social order grounded in ideology. The integration of music, offerings, and fire ceremonies reflects a system in which symbolic authority underpinned administrative coordination. Ritual authority required stable economic systems capable of sustaining large populations and supporting specialized labor. Between 3000 and 2500 BCE, the foundation of the Caral-Supe Civilization rested not on monumental architecture alone, but on the systematic control of water in one of the driest regions on Earth. The Supe Valley lies within Peru's hyperarid coastal desert, where rainfall is negligible and agriculture is impossible without artificial irrigation. Seasonal runoff from the Andes, however, flows through narrow river valleys toward the Pacific. Caral's inhabitants engineered irrigation canals to capture and redirect this runoff into adjacent floodplains, converting desert margins into productive farmland. Archaeological surveys have identified canal systems branching from the Supe River, some of which have been radiocarbon dated to approximately 2600 to 2400 BCE. Their scale and alignment suggest planned construction rather than small-scale household ditches. Maintaining these canals required periodic dredging, reinforcement of embankments, and coordinated labor, implying administrative oversight and communal organization. Hydraulic management therefore functioned as both an economic and political mechanism. It created surplus and required cooperation. Archaeobotanical remains recovered from Caral and nearby settlements confirm the cultivation of cotton, Gossypium barbadense, squash, beans, sweet potatoes, chili peppers, and guava. Among these crops, cotton held exceptional strategic importance. Unlike cereal-based civilizations of the Old World, Caral did not depend on grain agriculture as a staple foundation. Instead, cotton production supported the region's maritime economy. Coastal fishing communities required durable netting for large-scale marine harvesting, and cotton fiber provided the raw material. Inland agricultural producers and coastal fishers became economically interdependent. Cotton flowed toward the coast, while dried fish and marine resources circulated inland. This exchange system challenges earlier interpretations that prioritized maritime subsistence as the sole driver of social complexity. Instead, agricultural intensification and maritime exploitation appear mutually reinforcing. Cotton cultivation was not merely subsistence farming. It was an economic lever that tied valleys and shoreline settlements into a regional network. The ability to generate consistent food surplus from irrigated fields had broader social consequences. Surplus production reduced subsistence risk and supported population growth. More importantly, it allowed segments of the population to specialize in non-agricultural labor. Monumental construction at Caral, platform mounds, plazas, and residential compounds required sustained labor investment over decades. Such projects would not have been possible if all households were fully occupied with food production. Agricultural reliability therefore underpinned architectural ambition. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, Caral developed without metallurgy or ceramic technology during its peak. Yet the absence of these technologies did not prevent economic sophistication. Textile production from cotton may, in fact, have served as a primary medium of value and exchange. Some scholars propose that textiles functioned as prestige goods and administrative resources, reinforcing elite authority over production and distribution. In sum, irrigation agriculture in the Supe Valley was not a simple adaptation to environmental constraint. It was the structural foundation of Caral's social complexity. By transforming seasonal river flow into stable agricultural corridors, the civilization created surplus, specialization, interregional exchange, and administrative cohesion. Hydraulic management made possible the emergence of one of the earliest urban societies in the Americas without reliance on warfare, metal tools, or ceramic traditions. As surplus stabilized inland production, maritime networks expanded further, deepening the economic integration between valley settlements and Pacific coastal communities. Marine resources formed a central pillar of the Caral-Supe economic system. Zooarchaeological analysis from inland sites, including Caral itself, reveals significant quantities of anchovy, Angraulus ringens, and sardine remains transported from the Pacific coast. These species thrive in the cold, nutrient-rich waters of the Humboldt Current, one of the most productive marine ecosystems in the world. The abundance of small schooling fish made large-scale harvesting both feasible and reliable, generating protein surpluses capable of sustaining dense inland populations. Coastal settlements such as Espero functioned as specialized maritime hubs within this regional system. Excavations there have uncovered evidence of intensive fishing activity, including net weights and fish processing residues. The relationship between inland agricultural centers and coastal fishing communities appears structured around economic complementarity. Cotton cultivated in the Supe Valley supplied raw fiber for durable fishing nets. In return, dried and salted fish were transported inland, where marine proteins supplemented agricultural diets. This inland coastal exchange was not incidental. It was systematic. The repeated presence of marine remains at sites located dozens of kilometers from the ocean indicates established logistical networks rather than sporadic trade. Preservation techniques, likely sun-drying and salting, would have allowed fish to be stored and transported without rapid spoilage. The scale of distribution suggests organized coordination rather than household-level barter. Beyond subsistence exchange, evidence also points to longer-distance interaction. Marine shells such as Spondylus, native to the warmer waters off present-day Ecuador, have been identified at inland ceremonial contexts. Because these shells do not occur naturally along the Peruvian coast, their presence indicates exchange networks extending hundreds of kilometers. In later Andean societies, Spondylus held ritual and symbolic value, often associated with fertility, water, and elite status. Its appearance in the Caral-Supe sphere suggests early forms of prestige exchange and long-distance connectivity. Transport mechanisms in this period did not include wheeled vehicles, and draft animals were limited. While llamas were present in the Andes, their widespread use as pack animals may not yet have been fully developed during Caral's peak. Consequently, trade likely relied on a combination of human portage and small-scale llama caravans moving along established valley corridors. The absence of roads comparable to later Inca systems does not imply disorganization. Rather, movement would have followed river valleys and natural routes linking highland, inland, and coastal zones. The integrated economy functioned without coinage or written accounting systems. There is no evidence of script comparable to Mesopotamian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphics during this period. Instead, redistribution appears to have been centrally coordinated. Goods, cotton, fish, agricultural produce, and prestige shells were likely collected, stored, and reallocated through institutional mechanisms associated with ceremonial centers. Monumental architecture and plaza complexes may have served not only ritual purposes but also as nodes of storage, gathering, and controlled exchange. This redistributive model implies administrative authority rooted in coordination rather than coercion. Managing the flow of marine protein inland required scheduling, labor organization, and trust across communities. Such coordination reinforces the argument that economic complexity in the Andes preceded ceramic technology and developed independently of metallurgy or formal writing systems. In effect, the Caral-Supe Civilization demonstrates that urban integration can emerge through ecological complementarity. The desert valleys produced cotton and crops. The Pacific produced abundant fish. Distant regions supplied symbolic marine shells. These interconnected flows created a resilient economic web that supported population growth, monument construction, and ritual activity. As exchange networks expanded beyond immediate valleys and began incorporating long-distance prestige goods, mechanisms for coordination and symbolic authority became increasingly necessary. Economic integration, therefore, reinforced and depended upon ideological cohesion at the regional level. Between approximately 2600 and 2300 BCE, ceremonial architecture became one of the defining features of the Caral-Supe civilization. Across Caral and neighboring valley sites, archaeologists have identified a recurring architectural pattern: large platform mounds paired with circular sunken plazas. These features were not randomly arranged. Their symmetry, orientation, and standardized construction strongly suggest deliberate ceremonial planning and shared ritual norms across the region. The circular sunken plazas are particularly significant. Constructed below ground level and accessed by controlled stairways, these spaces created enclosed arenas for communal gathering. Their circular form fostered visibility and acoustic concentration, making them ideal settings for orchestrated ritual performances. Participants would have descended into a structured ceremonial environment, physically separated from the surrounding urban landscape. This architectural descent likely carried symbolic meaning, entering a sacred or ritually charged space distinct from daily life. Adjacent to many of these plazas are fire altars, often centrally positioned within rectangular ceremonial rooms. Excavations have uncovered ash deposits, burned botanical remains, and fragments of textiles and offerings within these altars. The controlled use of fire suggests repeated ritual activity rather than incidental domestic usage. Fire ceremonies may have been tied to seasonal agricultural cycles, reinforcing communal identity through recurring calendrical events. Among the offerings discovered at Caral are musical instruments, including flutes crafted from bird bones. These instruments were recovered from ceremonial contexts rather than domestic areas, indicating their use in formal ritual performance. Music, coordinated movement, and possibly spoken recitations would have enhanced the sensory intensity of gatherings. The architectural layout, plaza, platform, altar, implies choreographed sequences in which leaders guided participants through structured ceremonial acts. Notably absent from early strata is evidence of militarized iconography. Unlike contemporaneous civilizations in other parts of the world, Caral's ceremonial architecture does not prominently display images of warfare, weaponry, or conquest. There are no fortification walls surrounding the central precincts, nor are there clear depictions of martial elites dominating the visual record. This absence does not prove the complete lack of conflict, but it suggests that overt militarism was not the primary basis of authority during this period. Instead, leadership likely derived from ritual coordination and ideological influence. Priestly figures or ceremonial specialists would have overseen seasonal rites tied to agricultural production, irrigation maintenance, and communal labor mobilization. By aligning public ceremony with environmental cycles, planting, harvest, river flow, leaders position themselves as mediators between community and cosmos. Authority was thus embedded in perceived access to sacred knowledge and control over ritual timing. Architectural standardization across multiple sites reinforces the idea of shared ceremonial frameworks. The repetition of circular plazas and platform mounds throughout the Supe and adjacent valleys indicates regional integration rather than isolated experimentation. Such uniformity implies communication among settlements and the diffusion of ritual models. It also suggests that ceremonial architecture functioned as a visible marker of collective identity within a broader networked polity. Public ritual likely served several governance functions. First, it reinforced social hierarchy. Elevated platforms created literal and symbolic separation between officiants and participants. Second, it facilitated redistribution, as gatherings provided opportunities for coordinating labor and exchange. Third, it generated cohesion across dispersed communities by reaffirming shared beliefs. In this context, ceremonial plazas were not simply religious spaces, they were instruments of governance. Through controlled performance, spatial organization, and repeated symbolic acts, Caral's leaders structured both physical space and social hierarchy. Ritual performance became a mechanism for sustaining order, mobilizing labor, and legitimizing authority in the absence of militarized dominance. As these ceremonial systems expanded in scale and influence, maintaining cohesion across multiple valleys required increasingly sophisticated forms of symbolic communication. Ritual authority depended not only on performance but also on shared symbolic systems capable of transmitting meaning across generations and settlements. Sound and ceremony were instruments of political cohesion within the Caral-Supe civilization. Archaeological excavations at Caral have uncovered multiple sets of bone flutes, carefully crafted from pelican and Andean condor bones. placed within controlled ceremonial contexts. These instruments were not casual artifacts. Their placement within pyramidal complexes and sunken circular plazas indicates intentional use during formal ritual activity. Tonal analysis of replica flutes demonstrates that each instrument could produce distinct pitches, allowing for coordinated musical ensembles during communal ceremonies. Music, in this context, functioned as a medium for structuring collective participation, aligning participants' attention, and reinforcing ritual authority. In addition to musical instruments, textile fragments recovered from ceremonial areas indicate advanced weaving techniques. Cotton, cultivated inland, was spun and woven into fine textiles, some of which were deposited as offerings within ritual spaces. The technical skill evident in these textiles, uniform thread tension, patterned weaves, and careful finishing, suggests specialized labor. Their ceremonial use, combined with proximity to elite and sacred architecture, points to textiles as both functional and symbolic instruments. They communicated social differentiation, ritual participation, and the mediation of sacred knowledge by a select group of individuals. Symbolic objects extended beyond textiles and music. Offerings recovered from plazas and altars include marine shells, seeds, and botanical residues. Some shells, such as spondylus, originated from distant Ecuadorian waters, implying long-distance exchange and the importation of prestige goods. These items functioned as tangible markers of social and ritual networks, linking multiple settlements and reinforcing shared ideology. The presence of such objects in ceremonial contexts indicates that material culture mediated both communal identity and elite authority. The coordinated use of sound, textiles, and symbolic artifacts suggests that Carol's leaders exercised influence through orchestrated ritual performance. Music provided temporal and sensory structure to ceremonies, guiding collective action. Textiles signified technical skill, labor investment, and status, marking participants and leaders within the ritual hierarchy. Objects with symbolic or prestige value reinforced connections across ecological and social zones, strengthening a shared collective identity. These forms of material and performative communication operated independently of written texts, demonstrating how ideology can be encoded in physical culture and action. Archaeological evidence indicates that participation in ritual ceremonies was both inclusive and hierarchical. Sunken circular plazas allowed large gatherings of community members, while elevated platforms restricted access to ceremonial leaders. Musical performance likely required coordination among specialists, further emphasizing differentiated roles. The combination of spatial hierarchy, sound, and material symbolism reinforced social stratification while simultaneously integrating the population into a shared ideological framework. Participation in ceremony was a mechanism of social cohesion and a demonstration of the governance capacity of ritual authorities. Symbolic coordination may have extended into proto-administrative practices. While Carol lacks formal writing, material culture suggests systems for recording or representing collective knowledge. The distribution of textiles, musical instruments, and offerings in structured contexts indicates controlled allocation and management. Repetition of ceremonial arrangements across multiple plazas and settlements implies standardized protocols for ritual performance. Such practices could function as mnemonic or organizational tools, encoding procedural knowledge essential for communal governance. The integration of music, textiles, and symbolic artifacts also reflects interdependence between economic and ideological systems. Cotton production supported both practical needs, such as fishing nets and ceremonial display, linking economic labor to ritual authority. Imported shells and other prestige items required coordination across valleys and long-distance networks, embedding material flows within the ceremonial calendar. By integrating production, exchange, and ritual, the Caral-Supe system demonstrates an early model of complex social organization mediated through material culture. Collective identity was further reinforced through repeated performance. Ceremonial cycles likely coincided with agricultural or hydrological events, providing rhythm and predictability to communal life. Music synchronized participants, while ritualized object handling codified social roles. These practices embedded ideology into everyday experience without requiring literacy, formal record-keeping, or military enforcement. The result was a cohesive society capable of mobilizing labor, maintaining surplus, and sustaining monumental construction. In conclusion, the coordinated use of music, textiles, and symbolic objects in Caral highlights how material culture mediated ideology, authority, and collective identity. Bone flutes allowed ensemble performance, textiles conveyed social differentiation and technical mastery, and prestige goods reinforced regional networks. Together, these elements structured ritual practice, legitimized elite authority, and integrated the population into a shared social and ideological framework. Symbolic coordination, encoded in both material objects and performance, laid the groundwork for administrative and governance systems that would underpin the civilization's continued complexity. Symbolic coordination may have extended into proto-administrative record-keeping, establishing the material foundations for managing surplus, labor, and ceremonial scheduling across the Caral-Supe region. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, monument construction was no longer confined to the Supe Valley. Between approximately 2600 and 2300 BCE, the socio-political reach of the Caral-Supe civilization expanded into neighboring river systems, notably the Patavilca and Fortaleza valleys. Archaeological surveys of these regions reveal settlement patterns and monumental architecture closely paralleling those of Caral. Sites such as Huaracanga and Cabalit contain platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, and residential clusters organized with the same spatial logic observed in the Supe Valley. These similarities suggest coordinated urban planning and the transmission of technical knowledge across valleys. Radiocarbon dating confirms contemporaneous occupation of these sites within the same chronological window as Caral. Calibrated dates from construction deposits at Huaracanga cluster between 2600 and 2400 BCE, aligning closely with Caral's early monumental phases. Cabalit exhibits a similar temporal range. This synchronicity indicates that the development of complex settlements in these valleys was not a product of later diffusion but occurred in parallel under the influence of Caral's regional network. Architectural replication across valleys reflects deliberate planning and knowledge sharing, rather than independent or isolated innovation. Shikra technology, woven reed bags filled with stones used for foundation construction, appears consistently across Supe, Patavilca, and Fortaleza sites. Stratigraphic analysis shows similar fill materials, dimensions, and layering techniques. This consistency demonstrates the circulation of engineering expertise and suggests regional communication between construction teams. The replication of construction techniques enabled the creation of large, stable platform mounds in multiple valleys, supporting ceremonial functions and centralized administrative activity. Spatial organization at Huaracanga and Cabalit mirrors Caral's zoning principles. Central platform mounds dominate the settlement core, surrounded by residential clusters of varying size and complexity. Peripheral dwellings exhibit smaller, standardized layouts, indicating a tiered population structure. Sunken circular plazas are positioned adjacent to mounds, suggesting continuity in ceremonial practice. These architectural patterns reinforce the hypothesis that ritual and administrative functions were integrated within a cohesive regional framework. Notably, none of these intervalley sites display defensive fortifications or concentrations of weaponry. Settlement surveys have failed to identify walls, bastions, or fortified enclosures during this period. The absence of militarized infrastructure implies that expansion and integration were achieved through cooperative strategies rather than conquest. The Caral-Supe network appears to have relied on shared ideological frameworks, ritual cohesion, and coordinated labor to maintain social order and enforce regional hierarchies. Settlement hierarchy across valleys further illustrates administrative coordination. Caral functioned as the primary node, with Huaracanga, Cabalit, and similar sites serving as secondary centers. Smaller satellite communities cluster around these hubs, suggesting controlled dispersal of population and resources. The arrangement of central and peripheral settlements indicates that labor, goods, and ceremonial activity were organized at a superlocal level, supporting the view of an integrated regional polity. Ceremonial architecture reinforced social and political integration. The placement of sunken plazas, fire altars, and platform mounds along consistent orientations across valleys indicates standardized ritual protocols. Such uniformity would have facilitated the coordination of seasonal festivals and labor mobilization across multiple communities. Architectural consistency functioned as both a physical and symbolic expression of shared authority, signaling participation in a regional system that extended beyond any single valley. Economic interdependence complemented architectural integration. Cotton production, agricultural surplus, and marine resources circulated along valley corridors, linking inland and coastal settlements. The consistent presence of storage facilities and redistributive infrastructure across sites suggests that resource management was centrally coordinated. Surplus goods supported non-farming specialists, including artisans, ritual practitioners, and construction laborers, reinforcing both social stratification and network cohesion. The combination of architectural standardization, hierarchical settlement patterns, and synchronized occupation dates indicates that the Caral-Supe Civilization had developed mechanisms for inter-valley coordination without reliance on written records. Knowledge of construction techniques, ceremonial protocols, and labor management was transmitted orally or through apprenticeship, demonstrating the capacity for complex administration in the absence of literacy or metallurgy. By integrating the Patavilca and Fortaleza valleys, Carroll's influence extended over a broad ecological and demographic landscape. Monumental architecture, shared ceremonial design, and standardized engineering facilitated political cohesion across multiple river systems. This inter-valley network exemplifies early Andean strategies for regional governance, in which ideology, ritual, and coordinated labor substituted for coercive military authority. As architectural models spread throughout these valleys, centralized authority faced increasing challenges in managing demographic complexity. The coordination of population, labor, and surplus across multiple nodes required institutionalized mechanisms to maintain social cohesion, resource allocation, and ceremonial synchronization. Regional coordination required more than shared architecture. It required structured governance. Survey data across the Norte Chico region indicate the presence of roughly 20 major contemporaneous settlements, spanning the Supe, Patavilca, Fortaleza, and Waura valleys. These sites demonstrate a clear tiered hierarchy, reflecting a structured regional system capable of coordinating labor, surplus, and ceremonial activity without reliance on militarized authority. The distribution and organization of settlements suggest that political integration was achieved through administrative oversight and ritual cohesion rather than coercion. At the apex of this hierarchy were primary centers, most notably Caral, which contained the largest platform mounds, sunken plazas, and extensive residential complexes. Radiocarbon-dated construction layers place the peak of monumental building activity between approximately 2400 and 2200 BCE. Engineering estimates indicate that thousands of workers were mobilized for these projects, reflecting not only significant population density but also centralized planning to allocate labor efficiently. Large platforms, constructed with shikra foundations, required coordinated transport of stone, assembly of reed bags, and careful layer-by-layer deposition. The scale of these efforts necessitated administrative oversight to manage labor schedules, material procurement, and construction sequencing. Secondary settlements, such as Huaracanga in the Patavilca Valley and Cabalit in the Fortaleza Valley, exhibit smaller pyramidal platforms and modest sunken plazas. While these sites share the standardized architectural vocabulary of Caral, their reduced scale indicates a subordinate status within the regional network. Residential clusters surrounding secondary platforms were more uniform in size, suggesting less pronounced social stratification than in primary centers. These communities likely functioned as intermediate administrative nodes, facilitating labor coordination and surplus collection for ceremonial and economic purposes. Peripheral agrarian communities were located along river margins and agricultural terraces. These smaller settlements supported the production of crops, including cotton, squash, beans, and sweet potatoes, as well as participation in maritime trade networks. Archaeological evidence indicates that these communities contributed labor and goods to central centers, integrating them into the broader socio-political framework. Storage facilities at both secondary and primary sites, including stone-lined rooms and subterranean pits, indicate centralized accumulation and redistribution of agricultural and marine resources. This redistribution system allowed for provisioning of laborers, ceremonial participants, and craft specialists, ensuring continuity of regional integration. The absence of elite tombs, ostentatious grave goods, or militarized iconography in these settlements is noteworthy. Unlike contemporaneous civilizations in Mesopotamia or Egypt, where ruling authority was often reinforced through monumental tombs or warrior imagery, Caral-Supe governance appears to have relied on ritual and economic coordination. Leadership legitimacy was derived from the ability to orchestrate large-scale construction, manage resource flows, and oversee ceremonial activity. Architectural prominence, ceremonial spaces, and control over surplus functioned as material manifestations of authority. Spatial analysis of settlement distribution further demonstrates hierarchical integration. Primary centers are strategically located along major river systems, with secondary nodes positioned to facilitate coordination across valley corridors. Peripheral communities occupy arable floodplains and irrigation terraces, ensuring productive contributions to the regional economy. This spatial arrangement maximized both accessibility and resource distribution, enabling centralized coordination without extensive militarization or coercion. Labor mobilization at primary centers involved substantial social organization. Estimates suggest that hundreds of workers could have been deployed simultaneously in phases, with teams responsible for quarrying, transporting, weaving shikra bags, and assembling platforms. Ceremonial events, such as seasonal festivals, may have structured labor rotations, aligning communal activities with both agricultural cycles and ritual calendars. Such integration of economy, ritual, and construction demonstrates the sophistication of Caral-Supe administrative networks. Redistributive mechanisms appear embedded within architectural and ceremonial frameworks. Storage facilities and surplus accumulation were likely managed by centralized authorities, while ceremonial plazas and pyramidal platforms functioned as focal points for the coordination of labor and resource allocation. This integration allowed the civilization to maintain systemic stability across multiple valleys and settlement tiers. Coordination between primary, secondary, and peripheral nodes ensured both economic resilience and the capacity for sustained monumental construction. Social hierarchy within settlements was reinforced through architectural differentiation rather than personal ostentation. Larger residential compounds near ceremonial cores likely housed administrators, ritual specialists, or individuals responsible for managing surplus. Peripheral dwellings were standardized, reflecting a more egalitarian occupation. Burial evidence supports this interpretation. While some graves contain textiles or marine shell ornaments, no individual received conspicuous, elite-focused grave treatment. Authority was enacted through the organization of space, labor, and ritual rather than hereditary military dominance. The Caral-Supe model demonstrates that early complex societies could maintain political integration without reliance on coercion. Hierarchical coordination was achieved through structured settlement networks, redistributive administration, and ritual centrality. Architectural uniformity, combined with synchronized ceremonial practice, reinforced social cohesion across ecological and demographic diversity. These mechanisms allowed large populations to function as a coherent system while sustaining monumental construction and inter-valley cooperation. By approximately 2200 BCE, this system had reached a period of sustained stability. Primary, secondary, and peripheral sites maintained synchronized occupation and architectural continuity, reflecting institutionalized governance. Surplus production, labor mobilization, and ceremonial performance operated within a predictable framework, providing the social and economic infrastructure necessary for continued regional integration. Sustained regional integration culminated in a prolonged period of systemic stability, establishing the Caral-Supe Civilization as one of the earliest and most sophisticated examples of coordinated preceramic urbanism in the Americas. Climatic volatility began reshaping the Andean coastal environment around 2200 BCE, introducing challenges that would test the resilience of the Caral-Supe Civilization. Geoarchaeological research along Peru's north-central coast, particularly in the Supe, Patavilca, and Fortaleza valleys, reveals stratigraphic evidence consistent with intensified El Niño, Southern Oscillation, ENSO events. Sediment cores extracted from floodplains show unusually thick flood deposits and disrupted alluvial layers dated to this period. These deposits indicate episodic but significant flooding, suggesting periods of elevated rainfall and altered river flow patterns capable of damaging hydraulic infrastructure. Archaeological strata at Caral provide further evidence of environmental disruption. Excavation layers reveal repeated rebuilding and reinforcement of canal systems and agricultural terraces, indicating that extreme hydrological events had caused structural failure. Sheikra foundations and terrace walls were frequently reconstructed, with repairs often incorporating new fill material and additional stabilization measures. Radiocarbon dates from repair layers cluster within the late 3rd millennium BCE, coinciding with regional sedimentary evidence of El Niño-related flooding. This synchronicity suggests that repeated climatic stress directly impacted the functionality of agricultural and water management systems. Flooding events likely had cascading effects on both agricultural productivity and maritime resource availability. Excessive rainfall and high river discharge would have eroded irrigation channels, reducing the efficiency of water distribution to arable terraces. Simultaneously, changes in sea surface temperature associated with ENSO likely disrupted upwelling along the Humboldt Current, reducing the availability of small pelagic fish, including anchovy, Angralis ringens, and sardine. Given the integration of inland cotton-based agriculture with coastal fishing, declines in marine resources would have affected both nutrition and economic exchange. Stratigraphic and artifact analysis suggests that these environmental disruptions necessitated both labor and administrative coordination. The rebuilding of canals, terraces, and platform foundations would have required mobilization of workers and allocation of surplus, demonstrating the continued reliance on centralized authority. These repair episodes indicate that political and ritual institutions were closely linked to environmental management. The capacity to respond effectively to climate-induced damage reinforced elite authority, while also exposing potential vulnerabilities in administrative networks. Paleoenvironmental studies reinforce the broader regional impact of these ENSO events. Coastal cores show alternating layers of silted flood deposits and organic-rich sediments, reflecting repeated episodes of high runoff followed by sedimentation stabilization. Marine cores exhibit reduced upwelling signatures in the same temporal window, confirming that ocean productivity, and therefore food supply, was affected at a regional scale. Together, these data demonstrate that the Caral-Supe Civilization faced simultaneous stressors in both inland and coastal subsistence systems. These environmental pressures may have strained redistributive mechanisms. Surplus allocation depended on predictable agricultural output and consistent access to marine resources. When flood events destroyed canals or reduced harvests, the flow of food and cotton for textile and fishing net production would have been disrupted. Central authorities would have had to manage scarcity, coordinate labor for repairs, and maintain ceremonial activities, placing additional demands on social and administrative structures. While there is no evidence of widespread population abandonment at this time, repeated rebuilding episodes suggest that communities were repeatedly challenged by environmental volatility. The labor investment required to maintain hydraulic infrastructure under these conditions highlights both the resilience of administrative networks and the increasing fragility of systems dependent on environmental stability. Archaeological evidence does not indicate violent conflict as a response to these stresses, reinforcing the interpretation that political cohesion remained tied to coordination and ritual authority rather than coercion. Material culture also reflects adaptive responses. Canal realignments, terrace reinforcement, and platform repairs demonstrate an understanding of flood dynamics and hydrological management. The scale of reconstruction implies not only technical knowledge but also institutional capacity to organize collective labor. These adaptations, however, could only mitigate the effects of extreme events temporarily. The recurrence of ENSO-induced flooding placed ongoing strain on the civilization's economic and political systems. In sum, environmental archaeology clarifies how climatic events, without textual documentation, exerted systemic stress on Caral-Supe society. ENSO-induced floods damaged irrigation and terraces, disrupted coastal fisheries, and created challenges for redistributive administration. The repeated labor mobilization required to restore infrastructure underscores the interconnectedness of ecological stability, economic surplus, and ritual political authority. These pressures illustrate how environmental volatility shaped both social organization and regional cohesion. As infrastructure required repeated repair, Political cohesion faced mounting pressure, testing the capacity of centralized and ritual institutions to maintain order and sustain integrated labor and exchange networks. Economic strain challenges even stable systems. Following the climatic disruptions associated with intensified El Niño events around 2200 BCE, the Caral-Supe Civilization faced significant challenges in maintaining agricultural productivity and regional surplus. Geoarchaeological and archaeobotanical evidence suggests that canal sedimentation increased as floodwaters deposited silt and debris, reducing the efficiency of irrigation channels. Terrace walls required continuous maintenance, and accumulated sediment limited water flow to crop fields, directly impacting yields of cotton, squash, beans, and other cultivated species. Agricultural strain, in turn, stressed both inland production and the provisioning of coastal settlements that relied on reciprocal exchange. The unpredictability of marine resources compounded this pressure. ENSO events altered ocean temperature and upwelling, causing fluctuations in anchovy, Angralis ringens, and sardine populations. Fish transported from coastal hubs such as Espero became less reliable, reducing the consistent protein supply inland. The combination of lower crop yields and intermittent fish harvests undermined the previously stable surplus that supported large-scale labor mobilization, ceremonial construction, and redistributive administration. Archaeological evidence indicates that the labor demands for infrastructure maintenance intensified during this period. Canal repair and terrace reinforcement required the organization of large workforce groups, diverting labor from other productive or ceremonial tasks. Stratigraphic records at Caral and neighboring sites show repeated layers of repair, indicating ongoing adaptation to environmental strain. Shikra foundations of platform mounds were reinforced, terraces rebuilt, and storage structures repaired, highlighting the civilization's reliance on coordinated labor to maintain both infrastructure and social cohesion. Settlement patterns reveal differential impacts of these stresses. Excavations and regional surveys suggest that peripheral settlements, smaller agrarian communities, experienced declines in density following 2200 BCE. Some sites appear partially abandoned or reduced in size, indicating that environmental and economic pressures prompted relocation or population contraction. Primary centers, however, such as Caral, Warakanga, and Kabalit, continued to function, though with evidence of repair and recalibration of their administrative and ceremonial systems. This pattern implies that centralized nodes were resilient but reliant on consistent management of scarce resources. Redistribution systems, essential for sustaining non-farming specialists and ceremonial activity, required recalibration under these conditions. Surplus management depended on both predictable production and stable logistics. The temporary or chronic reduction in agricultural output and marine exchange necessitated careful allocation of resources to maintain labor for construction, ritual, and administrative tasks. Storage facilities, stone-lined rooms, and subterranean pits were used to buffer shortages, while ritual scheduling may have been adapted to coincide with periods of higher resource availability. Leaders were compelled to coordinate these efforts to preserve authority and prevent social disruption. The interaction of environmental stress and labor organization illustrates the vulnerability of irrigation-dependent societies. Hydraulic infrastructure required continuous maintenance, and any disruption in water delivery directly affected subsistence production. In the absence of alternative technologies such as metallurgy or ceramics, Caral-Supe relied on coordinated labor and administrative oversight to mitigate ecological unpredictability. These adaptations demonstrate both the resilience and fragility of early Andean civilization. Material culture further reflects these adjustments. Repaired terraces, re-leveled canal beds, and reinforced platforms indicate that technical knowledge and construction expertise were retained even under duress. Cotton cultivation, essential for both textiles and fishing nets, was prioritized, suggesting that resource allocation decisions balanced economic necessity with symbolic and ceremonial requirements. Food and textile distribution had to be carefully managed to support both subsistence and the legitimacy of ritual authority. In sum, the combination of reduced agricultural yields, intermittent marine resources, and heightened labor demands placed significant stress on the Caral-Supe economic system. Peripheral settlement contraction highlights the uneven impact of environmental strain across the region. Administrative and ritual mechanisms were required to manage resource scarcity, coordinate repair efforts, and sustain ceremonial functions. These pressures underscore the interdependence of ecological stability, surplus generation, and social cohesion in early complex societies. Prolonged stress gradually altered settlement patterns across the region, prompting both demographic shifts and institutional adaptations that would shape the subsequent phases of Caral-Supe development. Authority faded without visible conflict. Following approximately 2100 BCE, evidence suggests a gradual weakening of centralized coordination across the Caral-Supe civilization. Archaeological surveys indicate a cessation of large-scale monumental construction across multiple river valleys, including Supe, Patavilca, and Fortaleza. Platform mounds that had previously undergone periodic expansion show no further enlargement, and sunken plazas appear less frequently in new settlement layers. The halting of architectural development reflects a reduction in coordinated labor mobilization and a decline in superlocal planning. Settlement patterns also demonstrate increasing autonomy among formerly subordinate communities. Peripheral agrarian sites, which had been closely integrated into regional administrative networks, began to exhibit distinct architectural features and local construction techniques. Secondary settlements, previously mirroring Caral's standardized layouts, show evidence of independent building programs and altered ceremonial arrangements. This suggests that villages and towns assumed greater control over local resources and labor, operating with reduced oversight from central nodes. Radiocarbon sequences indicate that this decentralization was broadly synchronous across valleys rather than staggered, implying a systemic shift rather than localized collapse. Importantly, there is no archaeological evidence of widespread warfare, destruction layers, or fortifications constructed in response to conflict. Defensive architecture remains minimal, and mortuary evidence does not indicate violent upheaval. These observations support the interpretation that political fragmentation resulted from attritional processes, environmental stress, reduced surplus, and logistical challenges, rather than coercive overthrow. Administrative integration, which had previously linked multiple settlements through coordinated labor, surplus management, and ceremonial activity, began to dissolve. Storage facilities and redistributive structures appear less standardized, with fewer signs of central oversight. Surplus distribution became more localized, suggesting that primary centers could no longer manage resource flows across extensive regional networks. While ritual practice continued at individual settlements, its scale and uniformity diminished, indicating a decline in superregional ceremonial coordination. This gradual decentralization had demographic consequences. Settlement density in peripheral areas remained relatively stable or declined slightly, reflecting population dispersal and reorganization. Some communities consolidated around natural resources, such as reliable irrigation nodes or fertile floodplain terraces, while others were abandoned entirely. Central hubs like Caral experienced reduced occupation intensity, suggesting that population may have redistributed toward smaller, semi-autonomous settlements. These demographic shifts illustrate how fragmentation reshaped both settlement hierarchy and resource management. The decline of centralized authority also affected economic integration. Long-distance exchange networks, previously linking inland cotton production with coastal fisheries, became less efficient. Maritime goods continued to reach inland sites, but distribution appears irregular, with less evidence of coordinated storage or redistribution. Surplus that had supported labor specialization, monumental construction, and ceremonial participation decreased in both volume and consistency. Communities adapted by relying more heavily on local production and short-distance exchange, reflecting a shift from regional integration to localized subsistence strategies. Social hierarchy remained, but its expression became more localized. Architectural differentiation within settlements persisted, with larger compounds near ceremonial cores, but the scale and visibility of elite authority diminished. Leadership increasingly rested on local coordination of resources and ritual practice rather than superregional influence. This transition demonstrates that political power in early complex societies can shift gradually without violent disruption, relying instead on functional changes in administration and economic management. The causes of decentralization appear multifaceted. Environmental pressures from preceding El Niño events continued to impact agricultural productivity and marine resource availability. Maintenance of irrigation infrastructure became more labor-intensive, requiring decentralized management. Declines in surplus production reduced the capacity of primary centers to enforce or encourage participation in regional labor mobilization. In combination, these factors created conditions in which regional authority weakened organically, rather than through conquest or internal rebellion. This pattern underscores a broader principle in pre-ceramic Andean civilizations. Centralized authority depended heavily on environmental stability and efficient resource management. When ecological or economic conditions strained surplus production, administrative cohesion became increasingly difficult to maintain. Coordination that had previously enabled monumental construction, ritual standardization, and inter-valley integration gradually receded, leaving communities to operate with greater autonomy. By the end of this phase, the Caral-Supe network had entered a period of political fragmentation. Administrative authority shifted from superlocal coordination to localized oversight. Settlement autonomy increased, surplus management became decentralized, and ceremonial practice adapted to smaller-scale contexts. These changes laid the groundwork for the subsequent demographic and social reorganization across the Norte Chico region. Fragmentation reshaped demographic distribution, establishing a pattern of dispersed, semi-autonomous settlements that would dominate the final centuries of pre-ceramic occupation. This transition highlights how early complex societies could experience systemic reorganization without overt violence, demonstrating the interplay between environmental stress, economic pressure, and administrative capacity. Communities adapted through migration rather than resistance. Around 2000 to 1900 BCE, archaeological surveys across the Norte Chico region indicate significant population dispersal from primary coastal settlements toward inland valleys and emerging highland corridors. Coastal centers, including Caral and Espero, show reduced occupation intensity, as evidenced by thinner habitation layers, fewer domestic features, and diminished ceremonial construction. This shift suggests that environmental stress and declining resource predictability prompted communities to seek more sustainable locations, prioritizing access to reliable irrigation, arable land, and manageable population densities. Inland valleys, particularly those with stable riverine terraces, became focal points for resettlement. Excavations in secondary Supe and Patavilca settlements reveal expansion of domestic clusters, increased construction of modest platform mounds, and continued, but smaller-scale, ceremonial activity. Settlement growth in these areas reflects both natural population redistribution and a strategic response to declining coastal productivity. While the coast had provided abundant marine resources, periodic ENSO events increasingly disrupted fisheries, making inland agricultural production a more reliable subsistence base. Highland corridors adjacent to the coastal valleys also attracted populations. Archaeological surveys indicate that some communities relocated to terraces at higher elevations, where runoff from Andean streams supported perennial cultivation. These corridors offered protection from coastal flooding and erosion while still allowing access to lowland trade routes. Material culture, including remnants of cotton production, storage facilities, and tools, demonstrates that relocated populations maintained core aspects of their economic and ritual systems, albeit at reduced scale and complexity. The dispersal was not uniform. Primary ceremonial nodes experienced the most pronounced decline, whereas smaller secondary centers and agrarian communities often persisted or grew. Huaracanga, Cabalit, and similar settlements show evidence of sustained occupation, suggesting that less centralized nodes could adapt more effectively to resource scarcity. This pattern reinforces the idea that decentralized management and localized subsistence strategies became critical for survival during periods of environmental instability. Reduced coastal occupation also affected maritime exchange networks. Sites that had previously served as hubs for fish distribution show lower artifact density, smaller storage structures, and fewer imported prestige items such as spondylus shells. This reduction implies that long-distance exchange became less efficient and more localized. Inland communities increasingly relied on locally available resources, including irrigated crops, freshwater fauna, and secondary trade networks connecting neighboring valleys. Population shifts had social and administrative implications. With the dispersal of communities, ceremonial centers lost much of their administrative primacy. Authority that had previously extended over multiple valleys became increasingly localized, centered on smaller communities with the capacity to manage their own labor and surplus. Ritual practices continued, but ceremonies were adapted to fit the scale of new settlements, with fewer participants and simplified architectural layouts. Sunken circular plazas and small platform mounds persisted, but the uniformity and grandeur characteristic of earlier superlocal coordination diminished. Archaeobotanical evidence supports these demographic adjustments. Soil analyses from inland terraces indicate sustained cultivation of cotton, beans, and tubers, though production intensity appears lower than during peak pre-fragmentation periods. Terrace maintenance continued, but at a scale compatible with smaller populations and localized labor pools. This suggests that communities retained knowledge of agricultural and hydraulic techniques, applying them in a decentralized fashion to maintain subsistence and ritual practices. Material culture also reflects continuity amid adaptation. Tools, textiles, and ceremonial objects follow familiar stylistic patterns, indicating that relocated populations preserved cultural identity while adjusting to new environmental constraints. Musical instruments, flutes, and small ritual paraphernalia continue to appear in inland and highland contexts, demonstrating that symbolic practices remained integral to community cohesion, even as administrative hierarchies contracted. These settlement shifts illustrate mobility as a key adaptive strategy in unstable climates. Populations did not abandon cultural frameworks but instead reorganized spatially to optimize access to resources and reduce vulnerability to environmental volatility. Migration became a pragmatic mechanism for sustaining both economic and social systems when centralized coordination could no longer ensure stability. By approximately 1900 BCE, the pattern of population dispersal was largely established. Coastal ceremonial centers, once the focal points of intervalley integration, experienced reduced occupation intensity and waning influence. Inland and highland communities assumed greater responsibility for local governance, resource management, and ritual performance. Settlement reorganization reflects a systemic response to long-term environmental, economic, and administrative pressures rather than sudden collapse. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, ceremonial centers lost their administrative primacy. Authority transitioned to a more localized model, with smaller-scale ritual and economic coordination taking precedence. These shifts demonstrate that even in early complex societies, mobility and adaptive settlement strategies could maintain continuity of cultural and subsistence systems amid prolonged environmental and economic stress. The scale of Caral remained underestimated for decades. While sporadic references to mound complexes along Peru's north-central coast appeared in early 20th century surveys, the region's significance as a cradle of pre-ceramic civilization was largely unrecognized. Initial explorers noted the presence of stone structures and elevated platforms, but interpreted them as minor ceremonial sites rather than evidence of an extensive, organized urban network. The absence of ceramics and metallurgy contributed to the perception that these sites were peripheral or culturally marginal relative to better-known Old World civilizations. Systematic investigation of Caral began in 1994 under the direction of Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady. Shady's fieldwork employed stratigraphic excavation techniques, mapping, and surface surveys across the Supe Valley. Her team identified multiple platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, and residential clusters, establishing Caral as a major ceremonial and administrative center. Excavation revealed complex architectural sequences, including shikra bag foundations and multi-tiered terraces, demonstrating sophisticated engineering knowledge. The scale and coordination evident in these structures suggested the presence of centralized administration and social hierarchy well before the introduction of ceramics or metal tools. Radiocarbon dating was critical in redefining Caral's chronological significance. Samples taken from construction deposits, habitation layers, and organic offerings consistently returned calibrated dates ranging from approximately 3000 to 1800 BCE. These findings positioned Caral contemporaneously with the earliest Old World urban formations, including Sumerian cities in Mesopotamia. This chronological framework challenged earlier assumptions that urban development in the Americas lagged behind Eurasian civilizations, highlighting the independent emergence of complex society in the pre-ceramic Andes. Shady's work also emphasized regional integration. Surveys identified contemporaneous sites in the Patavilca, Fortaleza, and Waura valleys, suggesting that Caral functioned as a mother city within a network of smaller settlements. Architectural standardization, replicated platform designs, and shared ceremonial structures across these valleys indicated coordinated planning and knowledge transfer. Radiocarbon sequences confirmed simultaneous occupation, demonstrating that Caral's influence extended beyond a single valley and reshaping interpretations of early Andean socio-political organization. Early fieldwork also uncovered material evidence of economic and ritual complexity. Archaeologists documented extensive cotton cultivation, irrigation canals, and storage structures, demonstrating the capacity for surplus management and labor organization. Bone flutes, textiles, and ceremonial offerings highlighted the integration of ideology and social cohesion, further supporting the identification of Caral as a complex urban center. These findings overturned prior models that equated technological markers, such as metallurgy or ceramics, with societal complexity. The rediscovery of Caral sparked international scholarly interest and debate. Early reports questioned the dating and scale of pre-ceramic urbanism in the Andes, prompting further excavation and analysis. Subsequent research refined stratigraphic interpretation, improved radiocarbon calibration, and contextualized Caral within regional and global frameworks. Comparative studies emphasized Caral's independent development, demonstrating that complex social, economic, and ceremonial systems could emerge in the absence of conventional Old World technologies. Field methodology evolved alongside these discoveries. Detailed mapping, photogrammetry, and GIS analysis allowed researchers to quantify settlement hierarchies and architectural volume. Archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological analyses clarified subsistence strategies, including the integration of cotton agriculture and maritime resources. Sediment core studies and paleoenvironmental reconstruction provided insight into historical climate patterns and their impact on hydraulic management. Together, these techniques enabled a comprehensive understanding of Caral's social, economic, and environmental systems. Through early surveys and systematic excavation, Caral was firmly established as the earliest known complex society in the Americas. Its recognition expanded definitions of pre-ceramic urbanism and highlighted the role of environmental adaptation, labor coordination, and ideological cohesion in early state formation. By integrating architectural, material, and chronological data, Shady's work set a new standard for Andean archaeology and contributed to broader comparative studies of civilization. Scholarly debate followed chronological confirmation. Questions regarding the mechanisms of political authority, the function of ceremonial architecture, and the extent of inter-valley integration emerged. Researchers continue to examine Caral's relationship to contemporaneous sites, the organization of labor, and the role of ideology in governance. Early surveys and identification thus laid the foundation for decades of investigation, establishing Caral as a pivotal reference point in the study of pre-ceramic civilizations. Architectural memory outlived political authority. The ceremonial and urban design elements pioneered by the Caral-Supe Civilization, most notably sunken circular plazas and platform mounds, continued to influence subsequent Andean societies for centuries after the decline of centralized authority around 1800 BCE. Excavations in later coastal and highland settlements, including sites along the Moche and Chavin cultural corridors, reveal recurring use of raised platforms for ceremonial purposes and recessed plaza spaces for communal gatherings. These structural continuities suggest that ideological frameworks associated with communal ritual and social hierarchy were transmitted across generations, even in the absence of formal political unification. Platform mounds, constructed using methods reminiscent of shikra foundations, became a recurring feature in both coastal and inland contexts. Although later societies introduced ceramics, metallurgy, and new architectural materials, the basic principles of spatial hierarchy persisted. Elevated platforms served as focal points for ritual activity, while surrounding plazas facilitated collective participation. This enduring pattern demonstrates that Caral-Supe architectural innovation was not purely functional but also symbolic, encoding social and ritual norms that later cultures adopted and adapted to their own contexts. Sunken plazas similarly reflect continuity of ceremonial practice. While dimensions and construction techniques evolved, the arrangement of recessed spaces surrounded by platforms and associated residential clusters maintained the spatial logic first observed at Caral. Archaeological surveys indicate that plazas remained central to community life, functioning as stages for religious observances, public assembly, and intercommunity coordination. The replication of these designs across valleys and regions highlights the persistence of ideological memory embedded in built form. Regional surveys reveal that architectural continuities were not limited to direct geographic descendants. Highland sites show evidence of terrace-based ceremonial platforms and recessed plazas that echo the proportions and layout principles of Supe Valley prototypes. These adaptations suggest that even as populations migrated or reorganized following environmental stress, the conceptual framework of communal ceremonial space informed new construction, bridging ecological and demographic transitions. Material culture, including retained platform orientation and plaza circularity, indicates a conscious preservation of earlier symbolic systems. The persistence of architectural forms also aligns with broader cultural transmission mechanisms. Knowledge of construction techniques, spatial organization, and ceremonial function was likely transmitted through apprenticeship, ritual instruction, and labor organization. Even without written records, these practices ensured that ideological and social norms were perpetuated. Later Andean builders inherited the conceptual and practical vocabulary established by Caral-Supe architects, demonstrating that material forms can encode social memory across centuries. These continuities extend to settlement planning. Later urban and ceremonial centers retained hierarchical zoning, with primary mounds at central nodes, secondary structures surrounding them, and peripheral residential clusters. The replication of spatial organization underscores the enduring influence of Caral-Supe design principles on notions of authority, ritual centrality, and community interaction. Archaeologists interpret these patterns as evidence of enduring administrative and ideological templates, rather than coincidental architectural similarity. Structural evidence also indicates that certain functional strategies persisted. Terracing, water management, and reinforcement techniques introduced during the pre-ceramic period were adapted to later contexts. While later societies incorporated ceramics, metallurgy, and expanded crop repertoires, the underlying principles of integrating hydraulic control with ceremonial and residential spaces remained. This demonstrates that Caral-Supe innovations provided a technological as well as symbolic foundation for subsequent Andean civilizations. The enduring influence of Caral-Supe architecture highlights the interplay between material tradition and ideological continuity. While centralized political structures fragmented by 1800 BCE, the built environment preserved social memory and ceremonial logic. Elevated platforms and recessed plazas not only facilitated practical community functions but also embodied the authority, coordination, and ritual centrality characteristic of early pre-ceramic governance. Later societies adopted these forms to organize labor, ritual, and space, evidencing the transmission of conceptual frameworks independent of formal political control. Material continuity also offers insight into the temporal reach of early Andean ideology. The replication of plaza and platform forms across time and space illustrates that social memory can persist through tangible structures, shaping subsequent cultural and ceremonial norms. This architectural legacy underscores the role of built form as a repository of historical knowledge, providing a bridge between pre-ceramic innovations and later cultural developments. Administrative precedents also carried forward, linking architectural continuity to broader institutional patterns. Hierarchical zoning, labor mobilization, and resource management embedded in Caral-Supe construction practices informed subsequent systems of governance. Elevated platforms and organized plazas provided the spatial foundation for coordinated labor, ceremonial regulation, and communal oversight, offering a model for integrating social, economic, and ideological functions within a material framework. By tracing these continuities, it becomes evident that Caral-Supe architectural innovations shaped both the physical and social landscapes of later Andean civilizations, ensuring that the legacy of pre-ceramic urbanism endured far beyond the civilization's political lifespan. Before we continue into the next chapter, take a moment to hit the subscribe button, click the bell icon to catch every daily Nightfall history video, and leave a comment telling us which Caral-Supe innovation fascinated you most. Your insight becomes part of the discussion on humanity's earliest civilizations.